So what I would like to do in the second chapter of today's episode is to talk about one thing that's really also at the core of social psychology. And that is almost like this endorsement of this really extreme position, which is often called situationism, that states we should take the most important thing about behavior is the situation over everything. I put a question mark at the end just to kind of highlight that there's more nuance to it, as you will see in a second. But that is a position that is very much strongly endorsed by social psychologists, the importance of the situation. So here you see Kurt Lewin, one of the founding fathers of social psychology. Overall, really cool dude, great person, great scientist, not just because he's from Berlin, my hometown, but also he made a big impact, a very positive impact on psychology in general, and in particular on social psychology, and even on this module, because he said famously, okay, nothing is as practical as his theory, but if the theory only leads to more books and articles and doesn't really make a difference in the world, then this theory is worth nothing. And I think that's kind of like the guiding statement for our module as well. So thank you, Kurt, for helping us and for influencing us. And when he started in the 40s to kind of think about behavior in general, what he thought about is like, okay, so what influences, what creates the behavior people show? And he kind of formulated the field theory, which basically says that behavior is a function of the environment, which I beforehand and will continue to call situation. So behavior is a function of the environment. If I want to change behavior, if I want to understand behavior, I have to look for the situation. Nowadays, most psychologists, and Kurt Lewin himself later on, have more sophisticated versions of that. I think we would say something most would at least acknowledge that there's something like personal individual differences exist. So we would say like behavior is a function of the person and the environment, or most social psychologists, and I think most personality psychologists would agree on that. There's not only a function of the person and the situation, but also how the person and the situation interact with each other, right? But if you would ask me, do you want to change behavior, and you can bet either on the personality or on the situation, which factor do you pick? I would take the situation every day of the week, and that is a core assumption social psychologists have. So let's kind of look a little bit at the evidence in support of that. The picture is much more complicated in different fields of psychology, but here's a general idea behind it. So let's say, I was a little bit overly excited there. Let's say you're a personality psychologist, right? You would look at the commute and say like, oh, it matters whether the person is an introvert or an extrovert. Introverts might very much kind of love being on their own, love being isolated, whereas extrovert might suffer. So maybe the misery is basically just caused by extroverts, not by introverts. So what we have to take into account is just the person. We have to kind of think about that misery is a product of the person and the situation. But social psychologists would kind of push back and say like, let's see, what is it? If we change the behavior of the introvert and the extrovert, does that lead to the same behavior? So this is something that Apley and Schroeder in a study that I cited beforehand kind of tested. And so what they find is that it doesn't really matter whether you're a talker, an extrovert, or a loner, an introvert. So here on the y-axis, you again, higher scores indicate that you are happier. This is on the y-axis. On the x-axis, you see again two studies. You have the three conditions. The three conditions that you know. In the first study, they measured how actually they felt. So, and what they find is that there's no differences between talkers and loners in their happiness. So everyone who was instructed to find social connection reported the highest positive experience and affect, whereas those who were instructed to remain in solitude were the most miserable, independent of whether they were talkers or not. The only difference that emerged between these two people is that they had very different predictions. So talkers expected that they would be happy in the connection condition. They kind of overestimated it even a little bit. So they were kind of aligned with them. But you see that introverts expected to be really really miserable when they have to talk to somebody else, but actually they were quite happy doing so. So what we can see in this study here is that it's not so much who you are, but what you do. So it's not so much that it's introverts and extroverts have different social needs. No, we all have the same social needs, but we might think we have different needs. So that's really important to keep in mind. This might, like, if when I used to teach social psychology, personality psychology. I'm sorry. When I used to teach personality psychology, I would always point to kind of this study, one of the studies that makes a similar point as the one just pointed out. And so I would kind of start off pointing out that extroverts are massively more happy than introverts, and kind of saying, why is this the case? Is there something in the biology that is ingrained in them that you and I, if I'm, I have to admit, I'm rather extroverted, you might have noticed, and let's say you're introverted, okay, is there no chance for you to be as happy than I am? Or is it actually the difference why I'm happier than you? Let's assume that is the case. Is because we do different things, okay? So is it the trait that makes people happy, or is it the way that we act that makes people happy? What causes the happiness in extroverts, okay? So, and what happens when you instruct introverts to act as if they were extroverts? So this is the study. What they had to do is they have to discuss for 10 minutes parking problems at the university. And they either had to be extroverted, bold, talkative, energetic, assertive, a little bit like me, I'm afraid, or you had to be reserved, quiet, lethargic, compliant, unadventurous. That is, you have to act like an introvert. So here again, you see the positive affect on the y-axis. Higher numbers means that you are happier. And we can see that introverts and extroverts, okay, are much happier when they act as if they were extroverts, so the white thing, right? If they have acted as extroverts, then they were much happier. You can see here a little bit of a main effect as well. In dispositional introverts were a little bit less happy, or were clearly less happy than dispositional extroverts. But the key driver between that was the way they acted. Right, so it is basically acting as an extrovert that makes you happy, not so much being an extrovert. Okay, so here's like this the last slide of that study from Fleeson that I just showed you. Is like, okay, if you kind of want to know or try to explain the connection between extraversion and happiness, right? Then you can see kind of the production mechanism here. You have to kind of act as if you're extroverted. That produces the happiness, and that drives the connection. So if I want to make an introvert happier, I have to look for an extrovert and try to act more like an extrovert. As I always say, the world just needs to be a little bit more like me. No, I never say that, and I think probably that's not a good idea. Anyways. But let's think about a moment why this matters. Why is this so important, this perspective? And why does that offer so much promise, right? Because I think, look at this, the study or the intervention that I presented in our first episode, right? What I was saying is, okay, there are these two different types of students, some from traditional, some from non-traditional backgrounds, right? Some from non-widening participation, some from widening participation background. Now, if you're a personality, between them, there's a big achievement gap. If you're a personality psychologist, you think, oh, first thing you do is like, oh, maybe there's a difference in intelligence, there's in motivation. You kind of keep on looking what separates them, right? And you have maybe very little hope that they can actually change. You might think about, oh, we have to restructure education as a whole in order to accompany the widening participation students as well as we do for non-widening participation students. But as a social psychologist, you think, like, oh, what is the social dimension and how can we kind of change the situation that closes that gap? I truly believe that you can change, that person on the left can change, that the person on the left and the right are only separated by the way they act and not so much by who they are. And that is also one reason why social psychological interventions are so popular, because they kind of offer hope. They say, okay, when we change the situation, yes, then we can change the world and we can make people happier and more successful and have them experience more meaning.